the Middle Ages. Early 15th century, 476 CE. So what we think of as the Middle Ages or the medieval era covered almost 1,000 years in European history between the fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476 CE and the beginning of the Renaissance in the early 15th century. The people of this time did not think of themselves as being in the middle or between anything at all, of course. Only later did historians see this span of time as a period of lying between antiquity and the Renaissance, right in between. Very little notated music was survived from the antiquity, the period before the Middle Ages, whereas the preserved repertoire of the medieval music is enormous. The music of the Middle Ages reflects its many and varied social functions, both sacred and secular. The church dominated intellectual and cultural life during this period. Music, along with all the other arts, was perceived as means of serving God. Over the course of several hundred years, generations of anonymous composers, most of them monks and priests, developed an enormous repertoire of plain chant, also known as Gregorian chant. You've probably heard that before, which consisted of monophonic, unaccompanied melodies sung by a single voice or a choir in unison. Plain chant projected the words of the sacred liturgy in a manner that was at once clear and moving. Secular courts also needed music for their ceremonies and entertainments, and composers provided a steady stream of songs, setting of poems that tell of love, pain, heroism, and all of the other emotions that make up the human condition. Polyphony, multiple independent voices, sung or played together, became increasingly important for both sacred and secular music from the 10th century onward. The sounds of medieval music, both sacred and secular, may at first seem unfamiliar to us today. The scales in which they base their melodies differ from ours. Most of their instruments, we don't use them today. But the more we listen to this music, the more we can hear it in it, some of the same basic elements that we still use today. Above all, we can recognize in this music the effort of medieval composers to heighten the expressivity of the text they set and to elevate music beyond language. This basic urge connects us with music that is 1,000 years old. Music of sacred spaces. By far, the largest and most imposing structures of the Middle Ages were its churches, monuments to God, and physical testimonies to the power of the church itself. This was the era of the great Gothic cathedrals, buildings of unprecedented size, grace, and light. These structures did more than provide a space for worship. They were meant to inspire, to lift the eye heavenward, to instruct mortals about their relationship to the divine. The stained glass windows in these churches were similarly instructive, depicting biblical scenes in ways that could be understood even by those who couldn't read or write. You could still learn a story by looking at the art. Sacred music fulfilled a similar function. Its purpose was to enhance the text being sung and inspire worshipers with the beauty of their sound. Plain chant was the perfect vehicle for projecting sacred text with great clarity across enormous spaces. All of the services of the church were provided with their appropriate melodies, and there were many services the typical monk or nun attended church 9 times a day. 8 of these services were devoted to reading and singing prayers, psalms, hymns. But the most important service of the day was Mass, a ritual reenactment of Christ's Last Supper with his disciples. The anonymous composers of the early Middle Ages devoted special effort to the many chants of the Mass. Morality, plays like Hildegard's Bonvingen's Play of Virtues, combined plain chant with the newly composed poetry to convey the teachings of the Church and help the faithful learn the differences between good and evil. And we'll get more information about that in the chapter 1 on Hildegard's van Bingen. The next chapter, which is chapter 1 in your book, we will talk more about that. Then there was music for entertainment. As the great cathedrals were symbols of divine power, medieval castles were symbols of secular worldly power. Their stone walls and watery moats reflected the constant threat of attack from the outside. Medieval Europe was divided into a series of kingdoms, duchies, and fiefdoms of widely varying sizes, each ruled by a lord to whom subjects paid their allegiance and, of course, paid their taxes. Medieval courts used the arts as a means of projecting their cultural power and impressing the subjects and the visitors alike. Rulers competed for the services of the best poets, singers, and dances, which I would call them their gigging musicians of the day. Courtly life demanded courtly entertainments. Wandering minstrels passed from town to town and castle to castle, providing poetry, song, acrobatics, and juggling, sometimes combining all at once. Poet-composers known variously as troubadours in the south of present-day France, trouvères, and minnesingers, in what is now Germany, sang and played songs about love, heroism, and the pastoral life. Other courts employed their own full-time musicians and composers. Music featured prominently at nearly every courtly gathering. Medieval listeners, like listeners of today, enjoyed music that captured the simple pains and pleasures of being human. Behold Spring, by the prolific blind composer Francesco Landini, welcomes spring as a season of lightheartedness, beauty, and love. And we'll talk about that in chapter 4. Its flowing melody and resonant harmonies still speak to us today. Literary works, Giovanni Boccaccio's Decameron, and Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, both from the 15th century, remind us that medieval song texts could be as bawdy and explicit as any today. In each, travelers must take turns entertaining their companions, and song plays an important role throughout. Significantly, Boccaccio and Chaucer's both wrote in the vernacular languages of their respective regions, present-day Italy and present-day England, rather than in Latin, the language of the church. The language of the church is Latin. So, similarly, a good deal of medieval secular music, including Guillaume de Machaut, no more than one man could count the stars, was sung to text in the language of the people. And we'll talk about that for sure in chapter 5. So then there was music for dancing. In an era when relationships with the opposite sex outside of marriage were closely regulated, dance was a highly significant social activity. We have no detailed description of medieval dance, but we do have images of dancing as well as actual works of dance music that have survived from this time. Most dances appear to have been group activities somewhere similar to present-day line dancing, and almost every image of dancing comes with a drummer providing the basic beat. When thinking about medieval art and life today, we could consider, or should consider, not only what it looked like, but what it sounded like. The instruments of the Middle Ages were, for the most part, quite different from today. The shawm used in Alfonso El Sabio's The Talking Sheep, for example, was an early wind instrument that would eventually be replaced by the modern oboe. You can look at that in chapter 6, even though we're not even going to probably go through the chapter 6. I don't know. We're not going to cover chapter 6 in this course, but you can read about that in chapter 6 if you'd like. So, back to shawm used in Alfonso El Sabio's The Talking Sheep. Yet this work would sound very different if played on an oboe, for the shawm's more open and raspy sound belongs as much to the medieval world as the era's great churches and castles. So let's talk about information technology. The earliest medieval music was not notated until about the 10th century. And music was transmitted orally and not in written form. The earliest chant manuscripts show simple symbols above the text, indicating motion of the pitch up or down. Written music remained hard to come by even after the development of notation. Printing did not emerge until the middle of the 15th century, and so music, like all other texts, had to be written out by hand, one copy at a time by hand. Making manuscript was a time-consuming and a costly process because ink and parchment paper were expensive. Paper did not become widely available until the Renaissance, and scribes had to work slowly and carefully. Manuscripts, moreover, are not always entirely accurate. Scribes were only human, and anyone who has ever hand-copied, if you ever hand-copied a text of any complexity, will know how easy it is to leave out, repeat, or garble words, or even whole passages of a text. Even in the hands of the most skilled medieval scribes, these manuscripts were not always entirely faithful to the original. Here's a closer look at what that 12th century plain chant manuscript looks like. Beautiful, but all by hand. So you can imagine how gifted and talented you have to be accurate and to provide this kind of works. And as I said, scribes were only human. Anyone who has ever hand-copied a text, you understand. I mean, it's hard to get it accurate. And then I also say that when they went from church to church, like they had the song at one church, or the plain chant at one church, then they had to translate that, how to sing it at the next church, miles and miles away, and all they had were these neumes showing, okay, the melody is going to go up, and you're assuming how far it's going to go up or down. So it's not going to be perfect or exactly the same, maybe as the composer who created it. It's going to change from city to city, etc. So it's a very interesting time, and we'll get to more about notating music a little bit later on in this course, but this is the early period of putting the music down on paper. Now you'll notice in your book it's going to go to a quiz on the Middle Ages now. You don't have to do the quizzes in the actual Pearson book. Quizzes will be, this is a reminder, quizzes are online in Canvas. So make sure you're going through the modules. So after you read the chapter, you watch this as you just did, the lecture, read all of the material, and then take the quiz in Canvas, and that's where you'll get your grade. I hope you're having fun.